The night I watched a dead man walk off the last ferry from Alcatraz, the fog over San Francisco Bay felt like it was breathing on my neck, and for the first time in my life, I wished I had chosen any career other than photography. My name is Daniel Hart. I am a 34-year-old freelance photographer based in Oakland, and for most of my adult life, I have chased light and shadows through ruined factories, empty theaters, and abandoned motels, always thinking that the only ghosts in my work were metaphorical. That night proved me wrong, and I'm telling this because every time I shut my eyes, I still see wet footprints fading into the city streets, and I need someone else to carry at least a piece of this with me. I'd been hired by a small historical magazine to shoot a moody, atmospheric series on Alcatraz Island for a feature about how the prison had turned from a place of punishment into a tourist attraction. It sounded straightforward, if a little cliché, but I loved the idea of getting the island after hours without crowds of people in bright windbreakers ruining every frame. The park service arranged for me to join a late afternoon tour group and then stay back with one of the rangers so I could shoot the empty cell blocks as the sun went down. I packed my Canon, a backup body, 3 lenses, a tripod, extra batteries, and more memory cards than I could possibly need. I also packed my usual mild arrogance that nothing truly scary ever happens in the real world. The ferry ride out was normal enough. Kids leaned over the rails, parents yelled at them, people snapped selfies with the skyline behind them. The wind had that cold bay smell of salt, diesel, and seaweed. I remember watching the island grow larger, the main cell house sitting on the rock like a grey tooth, and thinking how small it looked compared to the myth of it. Inside, though, it felt like the stories. The daytime crowds dispersed as the early evening tour wrapped up, and the ranger assigned to babysit me, a woman named Carla, let me roam within a set boundary. I shot the long rows of empty cells in cell block B, the rust bleeding from old metal onto peeling walls, the heavy doors with their square windows like unblinking eyes. I went down to D block, the isolation cells, where they kept the worst of the worst. The air there felt thicker, colder, as if the concrete still remembered screams. My breath fogged in front of me, and for a second I thought it was someone else. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional distant clang from somewhere deeper in the building, and the soft, mechanical click of my shutter. At one point, I framed a shot down the length of D block, my camera on the tripod, shutter set to a long exposure to catch the last grey-blue of the evening. The place was empty. I double-checked. Nothing moved. I took the shot. As the camera processed, I felt something behind me, just a shift in the air, like a person stepping close, and a whisper of cold along my spine. "Almost done," I said over my shoulder, assuming it was Carla checking in, but no one answered. When I turned around, the corridor behind me was empty again, just the open doors and dark rectangles of the cells. I told myself this was what I wanted. The atmosphere, the eeriness that would sell the story, and kept working. Time ran faster than I realized. The last of the light drained out of the sky, and the interior lights flickered on, buzzing and yellow. The island changed character, turning from historic site into something that felt closer to what it had been. Isolated, cut off, floating in a dark sea. Carla found me near the hospital wing and told me we had to catch the last ferry back. She was polite about it, but there was an edge in her voice that made me pack faster. I asked if there were ever any issues with people getting stranded, trying to sound casual. She shook her head. "We do a sweep. No one stays after the last boat. You do not want to be here alone at night," she said. And she must have seen my eyebrows go up because she added, "Fog, currents, no emergency support, power issues. It is not a movie set, okay?" We headed down toward the dock. The path wound around the side of the island, past old guard towers and the shells of buildings eaten by weather and time. The fog was rolling in thick bands now, swallowing the lower parts of the Golden Gate Bridge and softening the lights of the city into a distant, swollen glow. I kept thinking how surreal it was that the most expensive city in America sat glittering right across the water from rust, rot, and memories of men who died in cold cells. There were maybe 15 people waiting at the dock for the last ferry. A few couples, 2 backpackers speaking German, an older man in a giant's cap, a family with 2 exhausted teenagers leaning against the railing. The boat itself, a white and green passenger ferry, pulled in with a low mechanical rumble and a blast of its horn that echoed off the rock in a way that made me flinch. We boarded quickly. The cabin was bright, too bright after the dim corridors of the prison, and people slipped into seats with the heavy, slow movements of those who had been walking all day. I chose a spot near a side window, not too close to anyone, planning to maybe get a few more shots of the island retreating into the dark. The engines shifted, lines were cast off, and the ferry began to pull away. That was when I first noticed him. At the very back of the cabin, by the rear window, a man was sitting alone. He wore an old-style khaki prison uniform, the kind I had seen in black, and white photos in the exhibits, with the number patch on the chest so faded I could not read it. His hair was dark and slicked back, his skin a sallow prison yard pale. He sat almost perfectly upright, hands on his knees, staring straight ahead, not at the island disappearing, but toward the front of the boat, as if he could see something there that none of us could. At first I thought he was part of some staff demonstration, or maybe an extra for a promotional shoot I had not been told about. The Park Service sometimes hires actors to play guards or inmates for special tours. I glanced around, expecting to see people pointing or whispering, but no one seemed to notice him. The backpackers were scrolling through their phones. The family was arguing softly about dinner. The man in the giant's cap had fallen half asleep. I looked back. The man in the uniform had not moved at all. Something about the fabric of his clothes bothered me. It did not catch the light the way modern cloth does. It seemed dull, almost greasy, and I realized with a small jolt that his pants were wet from the knees down. Not damp, wet, darker, heavier, clinging to his legs as if he had just waded out of the bay and sat down without bothering to dry off. A thin line of water glistened on the floor beneath his boots and then trickled slowly toward the center aisle, pooling in tiny reflective puddles. The rational part of my brain kicked in. Maybe he fell in on the dock. Maybe this was some weird performance art thing. Maybe I was just tired and reading too much into it. I pulled my camera up, more out of habit than anything, and zoomed in on him through the viewfinder. For a heartbeat, the glass framed him clearly. The sharp planes of his face, the deep-set eyes, the number on his chest that still would not come into focus. Then the camera hiccuped and refused to lock focus. The autofocus motor chattered back and forth but never caught. The image pulsed in and out, sharp then blurred, then sharp then blurred again, like the camera could not decide he was really there. I dropped it to my lap, suddenly very aware of my own breathing. I told myself to grow up. I stood, slung the camera over my shoulder, and walked slowly down the aisle, pretending to stretch my legs. The ferry rocked gently, the engines hummed, people barely glanced at me. As I got closer to the back, the air felt colder, enough that goosebumps prickled along my arms under my jacket. The smell changed too. The cabin smelled like old vinyl seats, damp jackets, a faint whiff of diesel. Around him there was an added scent, strong and sharp, like rust and stagnant water. I reached the last row before his and stopped, suddenly unsure what I thought I was doing. Up close, the details hit me harder. His hair was too perfectly slicked, with a style I had only seen in photos from the 40s and 50s. His face was hollow in the way of long starvation, cheeks sunken, eyes ringed with something that was not exactly dark circles, more like a shadow that lived under the skin. His lips were slightly parted, and I could see the edges of his teeth clenched tight. His boots were old, leather cracked, the laces thin like string, and water dripped from them in slow, consistent beads, like the bay was still clinging to him. "Hey man, you good?" I asked, and my voice sounded too loud in that part of the cabin. He did not respond. Not a blink, not a twitch, nothing. Just that fixed stare toward the front of the ferry. I glanced back toward the middle to see if anyone was watching this attempted good deed. No one was. The German backpackers laughed at something on a screen. The family's mom was rummaging in her bag. Carla the ranger was near the front, speaking to the captain through the small open window. I suddenly felt like there was a glass wall between the back of the boat and everyone else. The urge to test reality rose up fast and ugly. "Sir," I tried, a little more forcefully, "do you need any help?" Nothing. The cold deepened, settling into my fingers like I had plunged them into ice water. I was close enough now that I could see tiny droplets on the side of his neck, tracking down from the hairline like he had just emerged from under the surface. And then, without warning, his head turned. Not the way people normally turn their heads, with a small anticipatory shift in the shoulders or a tilt of the spine. His head turned in a smooth, mechanical motion 90 degrees until he was looking directly at me. His eyes were wrong. From a distance, they had just seemed shadowed. Up close, I could see that the irises were a pale, washed-out grey, almost the same colour as the whites. And there was something like a thin film over them, as though they had been underwater for a long time. For a second, we just stared at each other. A wave hit the hull, the ferry rocked, and I grabbed the seat back to steady myself. In that small lurch, the world seemed to tilt around his gaze, everything else smearing a little at the edges. My heart hammered so hard my vision pulsed. "You all right, sir?" I repeated, because my brain could not think of anything else to say. He blinked once, slowly, and when he opened his mouth, I braced for some slurred request or drunk mumble, anything human. Instead, what came out was the sound of bubbling, like air escaping from beneath water, followed by a raspy breath that smelled of old metal and salt. It felt like it passed through me rather than around me. I stumbled back, bumped into the seat behind me, and a woman in that row frowned and shifted her feet, muttering under her breath without really looking at me. I looked from her to him, wanting an anchor to something normal, but in the time it took to glance away and back, his head had already turned forward again, eyes fixed on the unseen horizon. I do not remember deciding to move. I just found myself almost running back up the aisle, grabbing the edge of my seat, sitting down too hard. My hands shook so much I nearly dropped the camera. I told myself I was exhausted, that I had worked a long day in a creepy place, and my nerves were firing at nothing. I forced myself to look back to the rear window to prove that he was just a man in a costume. I saw the empty row of seats. He was gone. The puddle was not. There was still a faint sheen of water on the floor where his boots had been, a darker patch in the aisle that stretched toward the door that led out onto the rear deck. No one had passed me. No one had brushed by, no footsteps, no shift in air, no door opening. I stood again, slower this time, and walked toward the back, scanning for him among the seats. Nothing. I reached the door to the deck and pushed it open. The night slapped me in the face with wind and fog. The deck was slick with moisture, the railing beaded with tiny droplets. The island was already receding behind us, a hunched, dark shape in the mist with a few scattered lights clinging to it. Beyond that, the city glowed faintly, half swallowed by low clouds. I heard the slap of water against the hull, the churn of the propellers, the distant horn of some other vessel. And something else, a rhythmic, wet sound, like bare feet on a damp floor. I looked down. Wet footprints led away from the door across the deck. Not shoe prints, bare footprints. Each one perfectly formed, toes splayed slightly, water shining in them like fresh ink. They were spaced evenly, as if made by someone walking at a steady pace toward the side of the boat, toward the railing. I followed them, my throat tight. They were not smeared by the wind or the motion of the ferry. They did not trail off or thin out. They just ended right at the rail. The last two prints set side by side, as if the person had stepped up onto an invisible ledge. I grabbed the rail and leaned over, half expecting to see something below in the churning dark water. A face, a hand, anything. There was nothing but the foam and the blackness. I felt dizzy, suddenly aware that if I tipped just a little too far, I could follow those prints into the bay. I forced myself back, hands numb, and turned to call someone, anyone, but the words died on my tongue. When I looked down again, the footprints were already fading, the water in them thinning out, edges blurring as if the deck itself was swallowing them. By the time I staggered back to the door, they were nothing but darker smudges among other patches of damp. The rest of the ride passed in a kind of stunned daze. I went back into the cabin, sat down and stared at nothing. When the captain announced that we were approaching Pier 33, people stirred, gathered their things, checked their phones. I tried to tell myself I had misinterpreted everything, that the man in the uniform had slipped past me somehow, that the footprints were spray patterns from the wake, that my tired eyes had invented shapes on wet metal. But when the ferry bumped against the dock and the doors opened, the smell hit me again for a split second. Rust and stagnant water cutting through the exhaust and city grime. I stepped off with the others onto the gangway. The night on the city side was wider but no less heavy. The fog had followed us, creeping between the piers, wrapping the streetlights in hazy halos. The crowd moved toward the exit, some peeling off toward the parking lot, others toward the Embarcadero. I lagged behind, feeling like I had left a piece of myself out there on the water. That was when I saw them, wet footprints on the concrete at the base of the gangway. The same bare, perfectly outlined prints I had seen on the deck, water shining in the dips of the toes and ball of the foot. They led away from the ferry, down the pier in the direction of the city. No one else reacted. A couple stepped right through them without looking down, leaving their own dry shoe marks alongside. The bare prints did not smear. They just kept appearing one after another, a trail only I seemed to see. I followed, because at that point I did not know what else to do. The air was colder near the ground, and the faint slap of bay water against the pilings echoed under the boards. The prints led me past the small ticket office, past tourists taking one last blurry photo of the dock sign, past a street performer packing up his gear. They moved steadily forward, never pausing, never turning aside, as if their maker knew exactly where he was going. My chest felt tight. I kept expecting them to vanish, but they did not. They reached the very end of the pier where the weathered boards met the concrete of the Embarcadero promenade. There, the trail stopped. The last two prints were set right at the edge, the toes almost hanging over the dark water below. I stood there staring, aware of cars passing behind me, voices laughing, the city very much alive and ordinary a few yards away, while I watched the final wet impressions slowly lose their shine. The prints did not walk back. They did not turn away into the crowds. They just ended there, as if the person who had made them had stepped off into nothing or into something I could not see. That was the moment when any comforting explanation finally fell apart. I went home that night, shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I backed up my photos immediately, hands unsteady on the keyboard, needing to know if I had caught anything on film that proved I was not losing my mind. Most of the shots were what I expected. Empty cell blocks, peeling paint, rusted door hinges, long shadows. When I reached the sequence from D block, the long exposure I had taken down the corridor, something in my stomach flipped. At the far end of the corridor, where the light was dimmest, a faint shape stood between the cells. Humanoid, darker than the surrounding shadows, head slightly bowed. Zooming in did not help. The pixels broke apart, But the outline remained, and within the vague blur of the chest area, I could almost make out the suggestion of a number patch. In the ferry shots, the ones I had taken absent-mindedly through the cabin, the man in the prison uniform did not appear. His seat was there, the rear window was there, the reflections of other passengers were there, but in the spot where he had sat, the image looked subtly warped, a faint distortion like heat shimmer on asphalt. When I cranked up the contrast, the distortion formed the edges of a human figure without any features, a hole in the photograph shaped like a man. I did not sleep that night, or the next. I started digging into Alcatraz history in the days after, obsessively reading about escape attempts and drownings. One name kept coming up in local legends, never fully confirmed, but repeated enough to lodge under my skin. A prisoner who had supposedly made it off the island during a foggy night in the 1950s, only to vanish in the bay, his body never recovered, some saying he still tried to finish his escape every time the last boat left. I will not say his name here, because if it was him, he has been chasing that shoreline longer than my entire lifetime, and I do not want to invite him any closer. For a while, I tried to convince myself that stress had twisted a series of coincidences into a ghost story. I had been alone in creepy places before and never seen anything. Maybe this was my brain finally buckling. But then, about 2 weeks after that night, I came home from a shoot on a rainy evening and walked into my apartment, kicking off my shoes on reflex. The hardwood floor of my small living room felt cold under my socks. I dropped my bag, turned on the lamp, and froze. From the door to the middle of the room, across the boards I had mopped 100 times, a trail of wet, bare footprints led inward, the same shape, the same spacing, as if someone had walked in from outside, dripping bay water, and stopped right where I was standing. There were no puddles near the door, no sign of a leak, no broken window. I stood there, heart thundering, watching as the prints slowly faded, the water thinning without soaking into anything, until the floor was as dry as if nothing had touched it. I do not go near the waterfront at night anymore. I stopped taking jobs that involve ferries or islands or anything to do with prisons. I turned down the magazine's request for a follow-up interview to promote the Alcatraz piece. They ran my photos anyway. People called them haunting and atmospheric, which is funny in a way I do not enjoy. Sometimes, when I'm alone, late in my editing studio, and the hum of the computer is the only sound, I will catch the faint smell of rust and cold bay water, and feel a drop of something land on my bare foot. I always look, and there is never anything there. Not yet. I know how this sounds. I would not believe me either if I had not watched those wet footprints walk off the last ferry from Alcatraz and vanish at the edge of the pier. But if one night you find yourself taking that same late boat back, and you notice a man sitting alone at the rear window in an old khaki uniform with water dripping from his boots, do yourself a favor. Do not talk to him. Do not follow the footprints. Some escapes are still in progress, and some passengers on that last ferry never really got off.